Charles Fraser. The Doves of Vengeancet. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 13. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production. "How much further is it?" I asked Holmes impatiently, whilst the taxi slowly bumped along the poorly maintained road. We had left Kingsland Road and turned into a narrow side street, whose name I had failed to notice. "We should be there any moment," answered my friend. I could hardly wait to meet Holmes's old acquaintance from his university days. Wilson, whose surname I did not know, had sent Holmes a telegram asking for help. Since my friend and I had not worked on any new cases for quite some time, this cry for help came at an almost opportune moment. Holmes's eyes began to sparkle as he read the telegram repeatedly. He reached for his coat, put the letter in his pocket, and said in a cheerful voice, "Come along, dear Dr. Watson. We have a new case to solve." Alice, the niece of the late Mrs Hudson, and thus our new landlady, as well as friend and helping hand in nearly all matters, promptly called us a taxi, which now came to a stop in front of a block of flats. "We're here," Holmes stated unnecessarily, whilst I was already in the process of paying the taxi driver. We left the taxi, and I asked, "Which floor does your friend live on?" "Third floor, number 13, Holmes replied, like a shot. I cast an anxious glance at my aching knee upon hearing that we would have to climb up to the third floor. Holmes, however, swung his walking stick euphorically and said to me, "I'm happy to lend you the stick should the many stairs prove troublesome." I declined, with admittedly inappropriate pride, and so I struggled up the steps, limping behind Holmes. Finally arriving at number 13, Holmes had already knocked on the door and was just adjusting his hat when the front door was flung open vigorously. "Sherlock!" the old man exclaimed joyfully. "What a pleasure to see you!" The appearing man, who must have been Holmes's friend Wilson, had short grey hair. The back of his head, however, was adorned with a roughly 8-inch-long tuft of hair tied into a ponytail. But it wasn't just his hairstyle that seemed rather peculiar. His clothing, too, appeared quite garish even by London standards. The man wore a green shirt and tight-fitting red trousers. I caught myself looking Wilson up and down whilst he, in turn, was effusively greeting Holmes and about to throw his arms around his neck. I took a large step backwards and observed the scene. Astonished, I watched as Holmes returned the gesture. I shook my head in amusement, for such emotional outbursts were certainly not among Holmes's characteristics. The two men shook hands. Then Holmes seemed to remember my presence again. He cleared his throat briefly and introduced me. "My dear Wilson, this is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Watson." I immediately extended my hand to avoid being subjected to his embrace as well. "We rushed to you immediately after receiving the telegram. So, old friend, what seems to be troubling you?" asked Holmes. Wilson stepped aside and beckoned us to enter. I let Holmes go first and followed him hesitantly. The small 2-room flat was just as garish as its occupant. It seemed as though someone couldn't decide on a single wall colour. But that wasn't all. Not only did pink, blue and yellow adorn the living room walls, one wall had also been decorated with tasteless floral wallpaper. The mismatched pieces of furniture formed a fitting ensemble, and the decorative collection of what felt like 100 garden gnomes was merely the cherry on top. "How lovely you've made it here," said Holmes with a smirk on his face, "but I hadn't expected anything else." "An interesting decorating style," I concurred with my friend. "You should have seen Wilson's room back in our university days," said Holmes, unable to suppress a quiet laugh. "But before we only talk about days long past, Wilson, how can we help you?" "Something absolutely dreadful has happened." Wilson buried his face despairingly in his hands. "Barney, he's been kidnapped." A cold shiver ran down my spine at the word kidnapping. Every hair stood on end, and cold sweat began to gather on my forehead. I had not yet fully overcome my own kidnapping case. Each new kidnapping case seemed to reopen the old wounds. "How dreadful," I murmured sympathetically. "Barney has been living with me for nearly 9 years now. He is always very reliable, you know. He appears punctually for every meal." Wilson sobbed. "Oh, well, that should not be anything extraordinary in itself," Holmes interjected. "I adopted him back then. Since that time, we have become truly good friends." "I'm terribly sorry for you, my friend," said Holmes, whilst patting Wilson sympathetically on the shoulder. "I promise you, we shall do everything to bring the lad back to you safely." "Which boy?" asked Wilson. I looked at Holmes in confusion, his facial expression mirroring mine. "Why, Barney?" he said. "But Barney is not a boy. Barney is my cat." "A cat!" Holmes and I exclaimed in unison. "Of course it's a cat. Sherlock, you know me. How on earth could I possibly take responsibility for a child? I can barely look after myself." I was completely perplexed. "You sent us an urgent telegram because of a cat. Are you serious?" I asked, dumbfounded. "Absolutely. After all, the police did not respond to my missing persons report, and I had to do something." Wilson defended himself. I merely shook my head. I looked at Holmes and noted with dismay that the glimmer which had just shone in his eyes at the prospect of a new case had vanished. Dejectedly, he reached for his hat and said to Wilson, "Watson and I must unfortunately leave now. I wish you the best of luck in finding your cat." "But Sherlock, you surely can't just abandon me like this. Whatever shall I do? Barney means everything to me." Now I almost felt sorry for Wilson again. I saw the pleading in his eyes, the desperation. "Wilson, Holmes and I shall sleep on it and think of something. I promise you, we shall return tomorrow. Perhaps Barney will have reappeared by then." "Watson, are you serious?" Holmes hissed at me, but I merely placed my arm soothingly on his and pulled him out through the door. The farewell was far less cordial than their initial greeting, and once we were back in the fresh air, Holmes took a deep breath. "A cat!" he exclaimed. "I simply cannot believe it." "Holmes, he likely has no one else. Did you see the grief in his face? Let us simply check on him again tomorrow." "Now the doctor in you is speaking again," Holmes remarked coldly and promptly hailed us a taxi. Holmes had withdrawn to his room immediately after our arrival in Baker Street last evening. He was visibly frustrated about how the meeting with Wilson had gone. However, I now felt sorry for the poor man and was firmly convinced that I would motivate Holmes for another meeting straight after breakfast. Reluctantly, my friend sat beside me in the taxi just a few hours later. Secretly, I very much hoped that Barney had reappeared in the meantime and that Holmes and Wilson could thus reminisce about the good old days, which would hopefully visibly brighten Holmes's mood. But at the moment, he sat silently beside me, staring out of the window. After what seemed an endless taxi journey, we had arrived once again in front of Wilson's residence. "Holmes, look here. It's not just Barney who's missing in this area, but also a pigeon." On a poster tacked to a tree, there was a sketch drawing of a pigeon. Above it, the word "missing" was emblazoned in large letters. The searcher also disclosed their address and offered a reward for its return. Who on earth would put up a missing poster for their pigeon? What a peculiar neighbourhood, I stated. "Ah, the poster was already there yesterday," was Holmes's only comment on the matter. Finally, we dragged ourselves back up the stairs to the 3rd floor. My knee groaned and ached, but I gritted my teeth. Having finally reached the top, Holmes knocked 3 times on the door with his walking stick. We waited for a brief moment, and Holmes repeated his knocking. But nothing happened. Holmes pressed his ear against the door and listened. "Nothing," he said. "I cannot hear any footsteps or any other sounds." "How peculiar," I said pensively. I was quite certain Wilson would be eagerly awaiting us. Holmes pressed the door handle and looked at me in surprise. "Not locked," he muttered conspiratorially. "What are you waiting for?" I urged him. Slowly and carefully, Holmes opened the door just a crack at first. We waited a few seconds, but nothing happened. Then Holmes opened the door further, and we entered. At first glance, we could not detect anything unusual. The hallway remained a mishmash of tastelessness. "Wilson, are you there?" Holmes called out in a hushed voice through the flat. But we received no answer. "Do you think he might be asleep?" I asked. "He would have had to change completely. When I think back to the old days, dear Wilson managed on just 3 or 4 hours of sleep a day. I simply believe too many muddled thoughts kept him from it." "Well then, nothing seems to have changed," I added sharply. We slowly proceeded into the living room. We stopped abruptly. Wilson was indeed there, though he was not sleeping. Rather, he had been murdered. He lay in a pool of his own blood with his throat slit, still clutching a garden gnome in his hand. "This cannot be." Holmes shook his head in disbelief. Then he slowly approached his friend and felt for a pulse. One need not be a doctor to know that my friend Holmes would find no pulse here. The man was irrevocably dead. Empty eyes, wide with terror, stared into nothingness. His skin was clammy and cold. I surmised to myself that it must have happened quite a while ago. "We must alert the police," I said quietly. I took a few steps towards Holmes and knelt down beside him with difficulty. I placed my hand on his arm in comfort. "You are right, Watson," he said, barely audibly. "Now I have my case," Holmes said through gritted teeth. "Perhaps now I shall finally be satisfied." "Don't be so hard on yourself. Who could have guessed yesterday what would happen today?" Holmes took a deep breath and rose. "Let us examine the flat before we alert the police, lest they destroy all the evidence." I agreed and began, quite literally, to turn over each garden gnome one by one. Several hours passed before Holmes and I gave up, utterly exhausted. We searched meticulously for any trace, even the smallest clue, but despite all our efforts, we could not discover anything remarkable. Finally, I informed Scotland Yard about the murder, and shortly thereafter, we had to answer Inspector Wolford's questions. Dejected, Holmes and I left Wilson's flat and took deep breaths as we emerged into the open air. "It is dreadful," I said to Holmes, deeply affected. He nodded to me silently. "I beg your pardon." A small, elderly woman addressed us from the side. "Are you with the police as well? Are they all here because of the missing pigeon?" "The pigeon? Oh, you mean the pigeon on the wanted poster? No, that's not why the police are here." I rolled my eyes in annoyance and was already turning away from the woman, but she wasn't so easily brushed off. "Why are they here then?" she wanted to know. I responded rather brusquely, "I don't think that—" But Holmes interrupted me. "My dear madam, the gentlemen from Scotland Yard are present due to a crime committed against a resident of this house." He pointed to the block of flats directly behind us. "So it is about Dave after all," said the elderly woman triumphantly. "I beg your pardon, but who is Dave?" Holmes inquired. "Why, the man with the missing pigeon." "Holmes, come along, let's go," I urged my friend, but he remained motionless. "So Dave lives in that house as well. How interesting. And how long has Dave been missing his pigeon?" Holmes wanted to know. The old woman shrugged her shoulders. "For a few days, I believe. But you know, Dave doesn't just have one pigeon. No, he has quite a lot. I don't know why anyone would keep so many pigeons in a flat in the middle of London, but you know how peculiar some people become when life has dealt them a cruel hand." "What hardships did the poor man have to endure?" Holmes inquired with interest. "His son died 4 years ago. I'm not quite sure of the cause, but his wife took her own life 2 weeks later. He's been rather peculiar since then, and as if that weren't misfortune enough, he's been confined to a wheelchair for about 6 months. Apparently, he was struck by a taxi whilst drunk. She whispered the last sentence to Holmes behind her cupped hand. Tragic, tragic, Holmes sighed. But you know what? Today, Dave is in luck. My friend and I are private detectives, and we shall take up his case and help him, at least to recover his pigeon. The old woman wept tears of joy and thanked Holmes profusely. Could you tell me which number Dave lives at? Holmes inquired of the little old lady. Second floor, number 9, she said cheerfully, and we bade her farewell. Hey, you cannot be serious, I confronted Holmes. I do feel sorry for Dave as well, but just because you no longer need to find a cat, we are now searching for pigeons. Holmes, this is utterly mad, I scolded. Wait and see, old friend, he said, though there it was again, that twinkle in Holmes's eyes. Had he found a lead? I needn't ask him about it. He wouldn't tell me anyway. Right then, I said, let us pay this Dave a visit. At least it was only the second floor this time, and not the third. Holmes knocked twice on the door. Just a moment, I'm coming. We could hear a voice from inside. It did indeed take some time until a man in a wheelchair opened the door for us. Yes, please, he said politely. You must be Dave, is that correct? Asked Holmes. The man nodded. And you are? I beg your pardon. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my friend and partner, Dr. Watson. We heard from a somewhat elderly lady that her pigeon has gone missing. Dave, who's there? We heard a shrill voice in the background. 2 gentlemen are at the door inquiring about the pigeon, Dave informed. Then at least invite the gentlemen in, since they've gone to the trouble. We don't wish to cause any trouble, I said, but Holmes discreetly nudged me in the side, which presumably meant that of course we wanted to be invited in, and most certainly cause trouble. Holmes did not even wait for an answer, but rather pushed past Dave and said, Most kind of you. I gave a brief shrug of my shoulders and followed Holmes into the flat. We took the liberty of seating ourselves in the kitchen straight away. Dave followed us in his wheelchair. May I offer you something to drink? That won't be necessary, thank you, said Holmes, looking directly at Dave. Let's get straight to the matter at hand. Can we be of any assistance in recovering your pigeon? Thank you, but I already have her back, said Dave. Oh my word! I hadn't the faintest idea about that. The shrill voice reached our ears once again. A hunched woman with a cigarette suddenly appeared, to whom this voice must have belonged. Why didn't you tell me that the silly bird was back? She thundered. May I introduce my mother? Said Dave. Pleased to meet you, said Holmes dutifully, though I could see he did not mean it. The mother sat down with us at the table, and Dave did not seem to like it at all. Ah, Dave, would you be so kind as to show us the pigeon? Ornithology has always been something I've been rather passionate about, said Holmes. Dave did not appear to be thrilled about it. Nevertheless, he said, Then I kindly ask you to follow me. He led us into the adjoining room, and I could hardly believe what I saw there. Besides a bed, a small wardrobe and a desk, the majority of the room consisted of an enormous pigeon loft. A good 50 birds must have called this place their home. Holmes and I feigned surprise. Splendid, Holmes exclaimed enthusiastically. Why did you not tell us straight away that you had fallen for pigeon breeding? Tell me, which bird was the one that went missing? Dave began to sneeze and blew his nose before he could answer. Here, the second one, right at the front of the first row. Yes, that one right there. Holmes pointed at the described bird, and Dave nodded. Then Dave had a violent sneezing fit. His eyes began to redden and suddenly appeared swollen. A slightly reddish rash spread across his skin, and Dave began to scratch himself furtively. I say, Dave, what's the matter with you? I asked with concern. Oh, it's nothing, he replied dismissively, whilst continuing to scratch himself. Meanwhile, Holmes had walked over to the desk and was suddenly holding a framed picture in his hands. Is this you, Dave? He asked. Dave nodded emotionlessly. Yes, that's me, before my accident. The photograph showed a happy family taking a stroll along the beach, consisting of a father, mother, and a small son. I am terribly sorry, said Holmes sympathetically. Are those your wife and son in the picture? Were, Dave said quietly and sneezed again. God rest their souls, said Holmes. If you'll permit the question, what happened? Dave swallowed hard. My son fell victim to an incompetent doctor. He died during a routine appendectomy. My wife took her own life a few weeks later. I really don't know what to say, I declared. If you would kindly leave now, said Dave, and he was visibly eager to be rid of us as quickly as possible. But of course, please accept our apologies, said Holmes. The bird has returned anyway, therefore we cannot be of any help to you now. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Dave replied politely whilst firmly ushering us towards the door. Having arrived back at Baker Street, we first made ourselves comfortable. Holmes lit his cigar whilst I poured us each a glass. I sank into my armchair, leaned back and crossed my legs. Holmes took another deep draw from his cigar. Then he addressed me. Well, Watson, what do you make of this, Dave? I pondered briefly and finally replied, He has a dreadful mother. Holmes smiled. I share that observation with you. What else? I was fascinated that he could identify the one missing pigeon amongst the approximately 50 birds. So he did that? Asked Holmes. I was somewhat irritated. But you saw that yourself. I saw how he simply named a pigeon. Do you remember the poster? As a distinguishing feature, red rings on both feet were specified. This pigeon had only one ring around its left foot, and it was blue. Among all the pigeons, I did not notice a single one that matched the description. Do you believe he still hasn't found the pigeon? I asked. Yes, I do believe so. However, she wasn't among the birds in the loft. Does that even matter at all? I mean, all these birds have nothing to do with our case, I said. Oh yes, they do, Holmes said mysteriously. I've had enough. Holmes, do speak up now and stop leaving me in the dark. This Dave is our murderer. I had expected everything, but not this. Holmes, this man is in a wheelchair. Are you suggesting he crawled up to Wilson on the 3rd floor, or was he carried there? That's absurd. And how on earth did you arrive at that conclusion? Do you recall the sudden sneezing fits Dave had when we entered his room? What do you make of that? Of course I remember. At first, I thought they were typical symptoms of an allergy, but then I realised it couldn't possibly have been the pigeons. No man could sleep night after night with such physical reactions next to an allergen source. Therefore, I have no idea what ultimately triggered this sudden cold, and whether it was actually an allergy. I believe your diagnosis is spot on, said Holmes. However, it really wasn't the pigeons that were responsible. Rather, in my opinion, Dave has a typical cat hair allergy. The runny nose, the red and swollen eyes, the rash. Clear symptoms if you ask me, but you're the doctor after all. You're right about that, but I couldn't see any cat, I replied. I didn't see one either. Nevertheless, I'm certain that one was hidden in that room. Peter, what sort of cat would hide so easily without making any sound at all? I interjected. A dead woman, said Holmes, and it is Wilson's. I was speechless for a brief moment. Why would Dave do such a thing? I said, having found my voice again. Now, let me share my thoughts with you, dear friend. First, according to the elderly lady who approached us in the street, the pigeon disappears. Then Wilson's cat vanishes. Dave said he didn't need our help as he had already found the pigeon. However, this was not in the dovecote, as Dave falsely wanted us to believe. Furthermore, Dave had an allergic reaction when entering the room. My suspicion is that the cat hunted down the pigeon, killed it, and devoured it. Subsequently, Dave seized the cat. One moment, Holmes. I interrupted him. "Dave is in a wheelchair. How could he possibly catch Wilson's cat?" "Either he intercepted it on the first floor, or his accomplice stepped in." "Where on earth would an accomplice come from now?" I interrupted him once again. "Well, I cannot tell you that yet, but there is one. I am certain of that. Dave could not possibly have managed Wilson's murder on his own." "The mother?" I asked. "Rather unlikely," answered Holmes. "Her statement about not knowing that her son had already found the pigeon does not fit into the picture." "Perhaps a ruse," I conjectured. "Do you believe the lady capable of such cunning thought processes?" I shook my head. But what motive could Dave have had for Wilson's murder? Just because he was responsible for his cat's death seems a bit shallow to me. "To be honest, I don't know that yet either," Holmes admitted through gritted teeth. We both remained silent for a while. Suddenly, Holmes reached for his walking stick and said, "Watson, search through all the newspapers from the past few days. Perhaps you'll notice something that seems peculiar to you. I shall pay a visit to the town library and dig through the archives. There might be something about the death of the boy from 4 years ago." "Why would the newspaper report about that?" I asked. "According to Dave, it was a medical error during surgery. Furthermore, the mother took her own life shortly afterwards. It's quite possible that a newspaper reported on it." I doubted the success of this endeavour, but said nothing. After all, it was a possibility. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. The room was slowly growing lighter again. Night was receding, and the first birds had already begun to chirp. Suddenly, I heard our flat door being carefully opened and closed again. Holmes must have returned. I swung my legs out of bed, reached for my dressing gown, and hastily put it on. Then I called out, "Holmes, is that you?" "Shouldn't you be asleep at this hour?" replied Holmes. "Firstly, I am not a small child anymore, and secondly, I can only return the question. Where have you been roaming about all night?" I asked him reproachfully. "I already told you that I wanted to visit the city library." "Did you find what you were looking for?" I asked hopefully. "Yes, I believe so. And you? How have you been getting on?" Holmes wanted to know. "Yeah, in last week's newspaper, that is to say, precisely 6 days ago, I found an article that might interest you," I said proudly. "Very good, Watson. Where is it then?" "Don't you want to get some sleep first? I mean, you've been out all night," I scolded Holmes. "Not now. I shall have plenty of time for sufficient sleep, in this life or the next." He winked at me and then said, "So, where is the article?" I rummaged through the newspaper in which I had already marked the article. Holmes flew over the lines and his grin grew ever wider. "Watson, you are a genius! We have solved the case." "Then you know more than I do." "Indeed, Watson. I have the missing half of the puzzle. Come, let us call a taxi and seek out Inspector Woolford." "But Holmes, can't this wait? It's only 5 o'clock in the morning." "The early bird catches the worm, dear Watson." I grumbled to myself, in this case, more likely the early pigeon. After we had successfully roused Inspector Woolford from his bed, and he in turn had drummed up several policemen, we finally gathered in front of the block of flats in the side alley of Kingsland Road. At first, Inspector Woolford was less than thrilled to find us at his doorstep at this hour. However, after we showed him the newspaper and Holmes explained the connections, his attitude changed. The article stated that Scotland Yard had unfortunately still not been able to arrest any suspects in the murder case of Dr. Fistel. He had been found dead in his flat 5 days prior with his throat slit. The body also showed a severe abdominal wound at the level of the appendix. Sadly, the deep cut had not been inflicted post-mortem. The motive remains under investigation. Now Inspector Woolford briefed his heavily armed men, drew his own pistol, and ordered Holmes and me to stay in the background. The officers stormed the building, and Holmes and I had our work cut out trying to keep up with them over the 3 floors. When we finally reached number 13, the door had already been broken down and 2 officers were securing the entrance. They willingly let us through, but what we found then left us speechless. In front of the kitchen table, lying in a pool of blood with her throat slashed, was Dave's mother. Her empty eyes stared at the ceiling, and in her right hand she still held a cigarette butt that had since burned down. We continued into Dave's room. The pigeons cooed excitedly to themselves and repeatedly flew nervously against the cage bars. Dave sat in the wheelchair next to the bed. His head hung to the left side, his throat also slashed. "We have already searched the flat. There is no one else here," said Inspector Wolford. I wrinkled my nose. I detected the smell of decay. Holmes naturally smelt it too. "What's that smell, Inspector? It surely can't be coming from these 2 bodies yet." Inspector Wolford opened the cupboard and held his nose. "We found this dead cat in here. Its entire underbelly has been slashed open. Unfortunately, we made the mistake of taking it out of the bag." "Barney!" I exclaimed. Now it was Holmes's turn to reveal his missing puzzle piece to expose the perpetrator. "Her name is Christine Shepherd. She is the mother of the girl who also underwent appendix surgery by Dr. Fistel 2 years ago and died afterwards. Dave must have read about it in the newspaper and contacted Christine. The 2 got to know each other better and stayed in touch. Their shared hatred for Dr. Fistel, who took their children from them, kept them together. But then Dave's accident interfered. By then, the 2 had likely already devised the necessary plans, but could no longer communicate as effectively because Dave's mobility was severely limited. His nosy mother was also becoming an issue, so Dave decided to use his pigeons as carrier pigeons to stay in contact with Christine. The pigeon that disappeared a few days ago presumably carried some sensitive information, and Dave witnessed the tomcat catching it. He probably first suspected that the cat Barney had eaten the note, which is why it had to die. When he found nothing in the cat, his next stop was Wilson. Of course, all the murders were committed by Christine Shepherd. Inspector Wolford swallowed hard. "Would you happen to have an address for this Christine Shepherd?" "Unfortunately not," said Holmes, "but that shouldn't be too difficult for you to find out." A few seconds later, Wolford had withdrawn with his officers. Only the 2 people guarding the front door and Holmes and I remained behind. "Do you think Inspector Wolford can track down this Christine Shepherd quickly?" I asked. "I am quite certain of that, Watson." "Shall we head home, Holmes?" "Not yet," he replied. "First, we have something else to take care of." Holmes opened the window of the room, then went back to the dovecote and opened the door. He took out one bird and went with it to the window. "Fly free for Dave's son," he murmured. Then he took out the next dove and said, "Fly free for Christine's daughter." We released more doves for Wilson, and also one for his cat Barney, one for Dave's mother, one for Dr. Fistel, and finally one each for Dave and Christine. They were the perpetrators and had caused much pain, yet they too had suffered greatly. Now we released the remaining doves. Each one of them represented pain and grief. Thus, our doves of revenge became doves of peace. You were listening to Charles Fraser. The Doves of Vengeancet. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 13. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production